Welcome to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, and on podcast on all the major platforms. I'm Paul Smith, host of Food Farm Talk. Please follow our podcast and our social media feeds. Today's episode is Connecting People to Place, featuring Rachel Lightfoot, a Nova Scotia organic and biodynamic wine producer. This is one episode in Stories of Regeneration, a series by Regeneration Canada, based in Montreal, Quebec, and Rural Roots for Climate Solutions, based in Stettler, Alberta, with funding from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Thanks to Regeneration Canada and Rural Roots for Climate Solutions for permission to air this episode. Rachel Lightfoot operates Lightfoot and Wolfville vineyards, where they grow and produce small lot wines in organic and biodynamic vineyards in Nova Scotia's Annapolis Valley. Enjoy.
Is there ever a part of you that just wants to give up after a growing season like this?
No, not yet. We'll see what's next. Yeah. I was explaining to Ali the other day and Sarah the concept of that we still have to have hope. And I guess as I look to the future, I try to be optimistic and hopeful. I think that there is still a lot we can do. I think we need to be operating in ways that mitigate some of these effects of climate change. Absolutely, that needs to be a priority. But I think that we're able to do that through things like regenerative agriculture, and that's why this is so important right now, because we're all facing this challenge together.
I'm Derek Leahy, host of the Rural Roots to Climate Solutions podcast. 2023 was a challenging year for Canadian farmers and ranchers, and for humanity in general. We had droughts, wildfires, floods, an affordability crisis, and a number of armed conflicts. According to scientists working with the European Union, 2023 smashed global temperature records. And yet someone like Nova Scotia agriculture producer Rachel Lightfoot still finds ways of being hopeful, of being optimistic, even after her farm got hit by a polar vortex, a dry spring, and a very rainy summer, all in the exact same year.
And one of the things that I did learn from my great-grandmother is it's important to count your blessings. It's something that she said all the time, and I feel that she really helped us to have a positive outlook, try to remain optimistic, and there are signs of hope even when it is tough. If you're looking for it, there are signs everywhere, and I think it's important for us to come together and find ways to kind of help mitigate some of these challenges that we're experiencing. And we're really fortunate to be part of a broader community where we're able to do that, and that certainly helps when it feels overwhelming.
Rural Roots to Climate Solutions, in partnership with Regeneration Canada, presents Stories of Regeneration, a podcast series exploring why we, as a society, need to get behind the farmers and ranchers who are regenerating the land, ecosystems, and local economies through their agricultural principles and practices. Farmers and ranchers who are striving for great things through regenerative agriculture. Part 5, Connecting People to Place, with Rachel Lightfoot of Lightfoot and Wolfville and Wolfville, Nova Scotia, July 18th, 2023.
My name is Rachel Lightfoot. I live in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, and I work for Lightfoot and Wolfville Vineyards, which is my family's farm winery. My sisters and I would be the fourth generation Lightfoots to farm here, and I work for the winery full time. The unique thing about the wine industry, it's very much agriculture. Of course, we are making an agricultural product, growing grapes, making wine, but there are so many other aspects that would be probably considered off-farm aspects. So I am also involved in the brand management, communication. I manage our website, content, social media, work with our label designer, and we have a new product coming out to kind of come up with packaging that fits and tells the story and matches the product. One of my favorite parts of my role is getting to meet people and share the product and connect. So I'm doing that here in Nova Scotia at the winery itself, and also get to do a bit of travel outside of the province and sometimes the country to help tell the story of Nova Scotia wine and show that we are making quality wines here. So that's a great aspect. We also have a hospitality program on site at the winery, so we have a tasting room as well as a restaurant and event venue. So I'm working pretty closely with our management team here in kind of a day-to-day operations role to make sure those teams are supported. And one of my favorite roles here at the winery with the hospitality team is a bit of an educational role, so helping to make sure that they're comfortable telling the stories of the products and where they were grown and come from. Every day is a little bit different. There's definitely lots of different elements, and it's very dynamic in that way, which is something that I really enjoy. It's far from monotonous.
One could even say it is biodynamic. Yeah, I promise that'll make way more sense if you keep listening to this episode. A very belated Happy New Year to everyone listening to this right now, and welcome back to the Stories of Regeneration podcast series. I'm actually pretty excited we're restarting the series after the Christmas break with this interview and this episode, because Lightfoot and Wolfville in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, is where our journey with this podcast series began. In some ways, it's where the overall Stories of Regeneration project began. You got to keep in mind that Stories of Regeneration is so much more than a podcast series. It's a multimedia project that began in 2023, shining a spotlight on regenerative agriculture producers in Canada. And part of that project is, this podcast series, but there's also a video series to go with it, along with a series of articles, a webinar series. And over the growing season of 2023, about a handful of farm-to-table dinners were hosted on various farms and ranches. And if memory serves me correctly, the very first farm-to-table dinner was actually at Femme Terre Potager in Rogersville, New Brunswick, with Rebecca Fraser-Chesson and everyone who's involved in that farming operation. If you remember, that one is actually a co-op. We heard from Rebecca in part 4 of our series. Lightfoot in Wolfville was a few firsts for our podcast. One, we've actually never had somebody working in viticulture on the podcast before. That is to say, we have never had someone who grows and processes grapes for wine on the podcast before. The Rural Roots to Climate Solutions podcast focuses on the land management practices and farm technology that are good for the farm, good for the climate, and a great fit for Alberta. So very rarely do we wander outside of Alberta modes of agricultural production. We tend to talk a lot of cattle, grain, and renewable energy on this podcast. We've never covered grapes or wine before. Oddly enough, because of this series, we actually wound up having 2 viticulturalists on the podcast. We'll hear from the second one, Aaron Goodard of Snowy Mountain Farms in Cawston, British Columbia, a little later in the series. So that was the first. The second first, as confusing as that sounds, it was the first time I had been to the East Coast. I never made it that far east before, which, in case you're wondering, the East Coast is absolutely beautiful. Here's Rachel talking about the place where she farms and the different types of agriculture products they produce. It's not just about wine at Lightfoot in Wolfville.
Yeah, so we are located in the Annapolis Valley of Nova Scotia. So what's really quite striking here, I guess, is the proximity to the Bay of Fundy. So both of our vineyard sites, you can see the Minas Basin. We're in very close proximity to that body of water. So the Bay of Fundy is famous for having the world's highest tides. So up to 16 meters or 50 feet in some places. So as you can imagine, with that tidal change, we're feeling that here. And so that's really what moderates our growing environment, and in terms of the wine styles that we're able to produce and what we're able to grow here, we're very much influenced by that special force and that really powerful Bay of Fundy. The valley itself is relatively long and fairly narrow. It's surrounded by 2 parallel mountain ranges, and the soils here, this site in particular, is there's a lot of glacial till, sandy loam. The region itself has quite an agricultural history. Apples were certainly a prominent crop that was grown here for many years, and still today. The Annapolis Valley is sort of the main agricultural hub of our province, and certainly lots of farming in this region.
Well, let's talk about the different types of farming that you have going on here. Like it's not just about grapes, as I've learned today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a farm winery, of course. We're farming 40 acres of grapevines for wine production, but we are an organic biodynamic farm, and so we are also farming animals and so livestock, and we're looking at the vineyard as a bit of an ecosystem, if you will. It's its own kind of living organism. And so part of that is farming the soil, of course, and the animals play an important role in that. So we have cattle, sheep, pigs. They all have their own kind of unique roles within our farm ecosystem. The whole idea is to be as self-sustaining, self-sufficient as possible. So some examples of that, the animal manures would be our main source of fertility for the vineyard. So we're composting the manures that are generated on site and putting that back into the soil to create a healthier living soil. The pigs, for example, they are living in the forest area around the vineyard, so they're helping to root out brush, and that helps to create better airflow around the vines. So there's all these unique kind of connections going on within the farm ecosystem. Those are the main livestock within this kind of whole farm cycle that we have going on. We also are growing vegetables for our restaurant here on site. So part of our philosophy at the winery is, I guess you could say, farm to table. So we are producing meats for the restaurant, so our own beef, pork, lamb. We're also growing herbs on site, so basil. The pizzas we had earlier would have been, herbs that we grew.
Which were delicious, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. Here on site. So we're also growing some lettuces and tomatoes.
I don't know about you, but I've lived most of my life pretty landlocked. Didn't matter if I was living in Ontario, Europe, or Alberta. I haven't spent much time living by coasts. Anyway, all this is to say is I just think there's something quite magical about places like the Bay of Fundy that have these massive tides. There's also something just mind-boggling about the color of the soil where Rachel farms. It has this amazing rust red color to it. And the whole day that we're at Rachel's place, I found myself quite frequently just grabbing a handful of soil, staring at it and thinking to myself, you can actually grow food in this stuff? And spoiler alert, you most certainly can.
Given the style that we produce here in Nova Scotia, our wines are fairly light, moderate, low alcohol. They have beautiful natural acidity, very crisp acidity, and so they're very much food wines. Very great to have. I think the best expression of our wines is alongside food, and so here we're so fortunate to be able to pair wines grown here with ingredients from this place for the full kind of exploration of full taste of place, if you will.
Very cool. Okay. And actually, I have to admit, I know nothing about wine. I'm more of a beer drinker than a wine drinker. So, cool. Are there some wines that are typical to your farm or the area that somebody like me who barely ever buys wine would know of?
Yeah. So what we're known for here in Nova Scotia, wine style wise, would be sparkling wines are one of the main focus points in the style that we can produce consistently at a very high quality level regardless of the growing season.
Okay.
So sparkling wines in the style of the Champagne method. So same methodology as the Champagne region in France. Of course, we can't call them champagnes, they're sparkling wines, but really really high quality, and that all goes back to our growing environment here and all the climatic factors that come together to give us our set of growing conditions. So sparkling wines, and the other main style would be aromatic whites. We have an appellation wine here called Tidal Bay. So it's named after the Bay of Fundy, the tidal influence that we talked about. And that's a crisp white blend, nice and fresh, very bright, crisp, low alcohol, really great pairing with seafood, which of course the region is quite well known for.
Okay.
So those are the main focus points of Nova Scotia. We do make red wines and rosé as well.
Just another question popped in my head, and I don't know if it's fair to ask somebody who runs a vineyard this question, and I know you also have to do a lot of marketing to move your product, but can I ask you what your favorite wine is?
Oh, yeah. Yes. So my favorite wine, sometimes I say it's hard to pick favorites, like I love them all for different reasons, and I think depending on the day and my mood and what I'm eating, it might be a different answer, of course, but I would say like day in, day out, it would probably be our Brut, which is a sparkling wine. Ours is 100% Chardonnay, which is probably my favorite grape here that we grow anyway on our vineyards, and yeah, it's just so good, so refreshing, and yeah, but they're all, like I said, it kind of depends on the day.
As I mentioned earlier, heading out to Lightfoot and Wolfville was a few firsts for our podcast and for myself. Another first, so I guess this would be the third first, and this one I found to be a very cool opportunity for our podcast, and it was that we've just never covered biodynamic agriculture in the podcast before. Now, to be fair, Carstairs agriculture producer Chris Vester has been on the podcast, and he is a certified biodynamic agriculture producer. The thing is, he was on the podcast about 1 million years ago, and we didn't ask him to explicitly talk about biodynamics in that episode. That episode was more about adapting agriculture practices to a changing climate. Well worth a listen. I think it's probably one of the first producer panel-esque podcast episodes we've ever done. Anyways, just trying to say I was pretty pumped to find out that we're finally going to explore biodynamics in the podcast.
Biodynamic agriculture, it's a form of regenerative agriculture and a form of organic agriculture. And I like to describe it as a bit of a philosophy, a way of kind of looking at your farm in a very holistic way. So at the core of biodynamics is the concept of the farm individuality. So it's looking at your farm as a whole kind of living organism. So it's its own being, if you will. And there's this belief that there are many interconnections between all of the different elements within. So the plants, the animals, the people. And the whole idea behind biodynamics is that your farm will be the healthiest if you are able to kind of sustain it in harmony with nature and with as little inputs as possible. So if we're able to, produce the fertility for the plants on the farm with the animals, then it will be the healthiest that it can be. And it started in just after the First World War in Europe. That's kind of the origins. And it was a time where petrochemicals were being used in agriculture for the first time, so synthetic fertilizers, and farmers were noticing that their soils were not as healthy as they once were. They were declining in terms of the overall vitality. Their crops weren't storing quite as well as they used to. And so there was a person by the name of Rudolf Steiner who gave a series of lectures that formed the basis of the biodynamic movement today. There are some practices that are very similar to organics, so no synthetic fertilizers, no chemical-based herbicides, fungicides, and then there's a few practices that biodynamic farmers would employ, such as the biodynamic preparations. So these are sort of natural treatments that we're using to all really centered around soil health. So soil health is a big focus of biodynamic agriculture. The preparations themselves consist of animal manures, minerals, and healing plants. So things like chamomile, valerian, dandelion even. So those are added to the compost, all kind of under the theme of increasing soil health. So that is a central through line with biodynamics. And for us, I really believe it helps with that quest to produce healthier soil, of course, healthier plants, and then ultimately better quality wines as a result that share that sense of place that we were talking about.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the explanation. So yeah, for regenerative agriculture, I'm curious, can you remember the first time you heard about regenerative agriculture? One of the first times, maybe.
Yeah, I don't exactly remember. I was trying to think back, and I first heard about Regeneration Canada through our friends at Southbrook Vineyards in Niagara. So they also practice biodynamic viticulture, and they kind of introduced us to what Regeneration Canada was doing. And I remember looking into the principles. This was a few years ago now, and seeing the parallels with biodynamics and some of the regenerative principles that Regeneration Canada was focused on. And I don't know if that was around the first time, but in the wine world right now, certainly regenerative viticulture is becoming talked about a lot more over the last few years, which is great to see. Reading a book right now, Dr. Jamie Good, who's a very influential wine writer from the UK, has written called Regenerative Viticulture, and it's kind of applying regenerative agriculture to viticulture. And so we're seeing it more and more over the last few years. So I don't know exactly when, but it's great to see more producers talking about these topics and really focused on soil health, on mitigating or farming more sustainably in a true sustainable way.
Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I can ask the question in a different way. Was there ever a time you even considered just being just isn't a nice word to use, but considered being a conventional farmer as opposed to a regenerative farmer or a biodynamic farmer? Did that ever cross your mind, or you were always on the regenerative path, do you think?
Yeah, I think for me, where I sort of started my career with the vineyard, and we were farming organically from the outside of the vineyard. So I really started that way and didn't really think to do anything else. And I feel very fortunate to be involved in organic agriculture. I think that we have a responsibility as a society to operate in ways that are more sustainable moving forward. I think the state of the climate we need to just do better, and whether that's organic or regenerative or what it is, I think that for me it just makes sense. It's the way that we need to move forward, is being mindful of our practices and that we're farming responsibly as possible.
Like New Brunswick agriculture producer Rebecca Fraser-Chasson, who we heard from in the previous episode, and BC agriculture producer Aaron Goodard, who we'll hear from just a little bit later in the series, Rachel is one of those agriculture producers who we interviewed for the Stories of Regeneration series, who for them, farming or ranching regeneratively is all they've ever known, even if they weren't calling it regenerative agriculture when they first started. Now, this is a contrast to the first three agriculture producers we heard from in the series. So Ryan Boyd in Manitoba, the Axtons of Saskatchewan, and Blake Vince in southwestern Ontario. All of these individuals had transitioned from conventional agriculture to regenerative agriculture. If you remember what I said at the end of part 3 with Blake Vince of Blockhair Farms in southwestern Ontario, if the Stories of Regeneration series was a book or a book series, book 1 would be the first 3 parts, and book 2, we're right in the middle of it right now. Book 3 is what we're going to use to wrap up the series. I'll let you know a little bit more about the overriding theme of book 3 as we get closer to the end of book 2. I just feel I wouldn't be doing my job right as a podcast host if I didn't build just a little bit of suspense. As Rachel rightly pointed out, biodynamic agriculture has a lot in common with regenerative agriculture. There's a similar emphasis on biodiversity, soil health, integrating livestock, animal welfare, and reducing the use of synthetic inputs in biodynamics. You could argue that one thing that makes biodynamics unique among all the different Western agricultural systems is that it sits at this interesting nexus of science, philosophy, and spirituality. In fact, the whole biodynamic movement was kicked off by an Austrian scientist and philosopher named Rudolf Steiner, in a lecture series he delivered in 1924, which was just a year before he passed away. To be fair, it was actually a group of agriculture producers who approached Steiner. These producers would have been from what was then Germany. They approached Steiner with their concerns about the increasing mechanization of agriculture and the beginnings of chemical fertilizers in agriculture, and how that was having an impact on the soil, their main concern being soil degradation. Raising these concerns to Steiner then spurred on an 8-part lecture series, which he went on to deliver. I bet that lecture series would have made one heck of a podcast series had it been done in this century. But that underlying concept to biodynamic agriculture is that a farm or ranch is alive like anything else. It's a living organism supported or degraded by everything that interacts with it. So people, other animals, pasture, market gardens, even its own spirit. And by working with all these elements, agriculture producers can steward and maintain resilient farms and ranches. Here's how Rachel's family farm got started.
It would have been my great-grandmother who was farming here. She would have been the first generation, and her name was Evelyn Rose Lightfoot. She was quite an inspiration to all of us, for sure. She's definitely an inspiration to me. She was a very independent woman. She was divorced in the 60s, so that was before that was a super common thing to do. And she continued to live here and farm on her own with her brother. And she had sort of a smaller kind of mixed farm. Apples were one of the main kind of commodities that they focused on during that generation. Of course, there's been different iterations over the different generations, and really just trying to sustain the land in agriculture and survive through the different evolutions, I guess you could say. And my dad, he grew up in town, but he spent a lot of time here with my great-grandmother, so his grandmother, and he was very inspired by her as well, and then decided to kind of carry on and become a farmer at a fairly young age.
Oh, the way your dad was talking about her earlier, and I hope your family's not going to be offended by me saying this. You just sounded like she was a total badass. She sounded really
She was
cool.
a badass for sure. Yeah, she was. She was very, very fierce. She was really quite special. And I was very lucky to have her influence in my life. Because she lived so late in life, I got to spend a lot of time with her and kind of learn from her, which was really, really cool. And then her son, my grandfather, Donnie, also another inspiration. He worked off of the farm. He was a barber in town for over 60 years, believe it or not. Yeah, so I think the part of the love of people and connecting people definitely comes down through him. He definitely loved that, like connecting with people, hearing their stories, and he luckily his last few years he got to spend here at the winery and see people every day, and he had a little scooter at the end, and he would scoot in and just roll up to people and have the greatest chats. So yeah, he worked, on the farm, but also off the farm as well.
You've probably pieced it together by this point, but each episode in the Stories of Regeneration series is meant to spotlight a principle of regenerative agriculture. It seems only fitting for a farm that practices biodynamic agriculture that the principle we're looking at in this episode is reciprocity within both natural and human ecosystems. Since, it's pretty important in biodynamics to generate what the farm needs for soil health, seeds, and pest management on farm. Again, there's that closed loop system we talked about in part 4. If you're curious, biodynamics also has its own set of principles, and they have a lot in common with the regen ag principles. And as we mentioned earlier in the series, regenerative agriculture is a big enough tent for a whole bunch of different ways of farming and ranching to fit into or to fit under. Reciprocity between natural and human ecosystems means making sure whatever we take in when we're producing foods, fibers, fuels, and medicine is given back. By providing plants with macro and micronutrients through organic inputs, we can restore the soil's biological nutrient cycling abilities. Green manures, compost, animal manure are all great examples of organic materials that enhance the biological functions of soils. Part of embracing this principle is recognizing natural materials should be used instead of synthetics whenever possible. Here's Rachel explaining how this reciprocity works on her farm.
Yeah, so they are, producing a crop, of course, every year. And so that is taking nutrition out of the soil. And so if we want to kind of continue building the soil, we need to be mindful that we're not taking more than we're giving. So it's all a balance of making sure that we're giving back to the soil what we're taking out. And practices such as, cover cropping and composting are helping us to do that, to give back to the soil and feed the soil, make sure that it is alive. Of course, there's a whole world of life happening in the soil in terms of the microbiology, and that's so important as it relates to vine health and plant health, and ultimately to wine quality as well.
Okay. Definitely ask you about that when we talk about those other benefits when it comes to healthy soil and the practices. But yeah, let's talk about those practices. So yeah, I'm familiar with cover cropping on out in the prairies, composting I know a little bit about, but yeah, I'm just curious if you can explain when you implement these practices. Do you put a cover crop in a certain time of year, for what purpose, et cetera, just sort of how do your practices feed the soil and keep the soil healthy here, and how you go about doing it?
Yeah, so for us, we're keeping the soil covered in the in the middle of the row as much as possible. So we are kind of keeping a crop there all the time. We have kind of a clover, many grasses. So when those are mowed and they become a mulch, that's kind of breaking down and going into the soil. Or in our case, we're using sheep to do that for part of the season. So the sheep, for example, would enter the vineyard early in the year, so before bud break, and at that time we have a lot of early weeds coming up. Our cover crop that's between the rows, our grass cover is starting to be of the size where they can graze, and so they're leaving their manure as they go, so that's helping with fertilization. Then we have to move the sheep out of the vineyard for the canopy to form, and then they go back in later in the season, and they actually help us with removing leaves around the fruit zone at that time. So that's one of the practices that we're using. The biodynamic preparations, this is the time of year early in the season where we would be applying, for example, the cow horn manure prep, which is a soil spray that we mix in water, and that's being applied directly to the soil to help with soil health, soil vitality. So that happens early in the season.
Just going to jump in here quickly to explain what cow horn manure preparation is. First of all, as Rachel said, it's a spray to feed the soil. The unique twist to it is that the manure is placed inside a cow horn and buried over winter, and then it's turned into a spray the following year or the following growing season. I would love to find a study comparing the potency of just normal manure with manure that spent an entire winter hanging out with the vast soil microbial community that we talked about in part 3 of our series. Another principle in regenerative agriculture that we've talked about in this series already is integrating livestock. And it's usually to get nutrients via livestock manure and urine back into the soil. I like how Rachel does that, but she also uses her sheep to prune the grapevines.
Yeah, and then compost, it depends on the year. So we're constantly sort of forming our compost pile. So that's being made up of animal manure. So every time we're cleaning out our barn after winter, for example, we'll have straw, a mix of cow manure, sheep manure, and so we're composting that, adding the biodynamic preparations. So some of those herbal kind of preparations that we talked about to the compost, which help to make sure the pH of the pile is right, make sure that it's degrading properly, and that can be applied depending on when the soil needs it. So we are doing soil testing to check in on our organic matter, and for us, where we are growing wine grapes, some of our soils tend to be at times a bit too fertile, so we have to be careful to keep things balanced to make sure that we're applying compost as it's needed and not overdoing it or having too much nitrogen in the soil.
So how often do you have to test your soil then?
Generally, we are at least once a year, sometimes twice a year,
Okay.
checking back in and seeing, how things are going. Here we have one block on our home farm vineyard that is a bit rockier than the other sites, and so that needs more soil amendment, more composting in that area, more compost applications in that area to because the organic matter is naturally lower. It really depends on the site and on the soil structure itself, how often we need to be adding those practices.
Okay, so yeah, for practices, we talked about integrating livestock, get some fertility, and also do some weed management apparently. So adding compost, those biodynamic preparations, any other, cover crops, that's another one we could talk about too, yeah.
So, another big focus for us would be promoting biodiversity within our farm organism or the ecosystem around the vineyard. So
Okay.
biodynamic producers, a vineyard is inherently a monoculture. With biodynamics, we're looking to create as much kind of life and biodiversity around the vineyard as possible. So the cover crops part of that, it's providing a habitat for beneficial insects. And here around the vineyard, we're leaving, some like forest area that is a great habitat for wildlife. We're seeing, eagles and hawks and all kinds of, raccoons and all different types of wildlife that help to show that the ecosystem is in balance, which is really important. A more kind of diverse system hopefully will be a healthier one and have more resilience inherently. So that's important for us. Planting pollinator plants around, so the gardens kind of surrounding is another kind of step that we take to ensure that we're promoting as much insect diversity as possible also.
Now there's a certain, and I suppose we'll probably address this in a couple other questions as well, but like a connection between the humans that interact with this place and the natural world, and the idea, and I think this kind of goes back to your holistic approach anyways, like these things should be interacting with each other. So like reciprocity is probably a good word to use there. So what is this like reciprocal exchange that you're trying to get going on here between human beings? Not to say human beings aren't part of the natural world, but sometimes we do a really bad job fitting into the natural world. So what does that exchange look like between us and, I guess, everything that's wild around us?
Yeah, I think that we try to keep in mind that we are part of that natural world as humans, and people play a role in that. The role that we play in terroir exploration or expression. So we are very much a part of that. I think our modern society today, we've become disconnected to nature, unfortunately, in a lot of ways. And biodynamics, especially, there's a bit of, with biodynamics, we pay attention to the way that Earth is influenced by the cosmos, so the cosmic forces, and the moon. We know that as humans we are influenced by that, but we as a society have become in some ways disconnected from it, more so than earlier cultures were. And so that's something that I feel like these farming practices really help us to become more aware of and more connected to, is the influence that we have on the natural world, and also that the natural world has on us.
The biodynamic calendar is something I've always found quite intriguing, and I'd love to use it sometime in the limited farming that I still do these days. The idea with the calendar is that the cycles of the moon and the movement and positioning of the planets and constellations will actually determine the best times to cultivate, to seed, to harvest, etc. By timing it right, the thought in biodynamics is an agriculture producer's being strategically tapping into the effects the moon, sun, and planets have on what you're growing and what you're producing. If you think of it, it actually takes that really important principle in regenerative agriculture. So understanding the context you're farming or ranching in, it takes that principle to a whole other level, since it's factoring in the moon, the planets, and constellations. Resilience is one of the benefits of Rachel's agriculture practices that we get into in this next section. The connection between on-farm or on-ranch diversity and resilience came up a few times in my interview with Rachel. In fact, it's something we'll be exploring in more detail with BC agriculture producer Aaron Goodard later on in this series.
One of the ways that the cover crops is helping the soil is with moisture retention. So it's helping to, like during dry periods, it's bringing moisture to the soil, in addition to the microbe activity. So that's another big aspect for us of why we would do that. It also helps to prevent soil erosion, which is really important, especially in our Avenport site that's quite sloped. We're on quite a slopey site there, so
Right.
helping to prevent erosion of the soil is critical. And moisture would be another big benefit of having a cover crop in the vineyard.
Okay. What are some of the other benefits of the practices that you guys use here? So obviously we made a pretty strong case that it helps the soil health. You're mentioning moisture retention. Like, what are some other like on-farm benefits, if I can call it that, to the practices you've chosen to use here?
Well, we think this year, as we discussed after the polar vortex event that we had, the vineyard is in recovery mode at the moment. Our vines definitely went through a stressful event, and so our canopy growth looks different this year than it normally would. But one thing we are finding is I think there is an overall resiliency. It seems that the sites that we are farming this way seem to have just an overall plant health seems to be flourishing a bit more than you might expect, with some of the varieties that we're growing, especially the cold sensitive vinifera varieties. Chardonnay, Riesling, for example, here on this site. We're seeing them bounce back in a way that we wouldn't have expected, considering the stress of the winter event that they went through. So I think an overall resiliency is one of the main benefits, or overall kind of health immunity. In terms of the rest of the property, I think definitely seeing a lot of life. So today when we were out walking the vineyard, you could see lots of insect life, lots of pollinators there. I think that, the ecosystem feels very much alive, and that's really what we want to see.
How actually does pollination work with grapevines? I don't have a clue. I didn't see any flowers out there, but obviously it's a little late in the season, but yeah.
Grapevines are actually self-pollinating.
Oh.
So we don't actually need the pollinators for the vineyard per se.
Okay.
So it's more about the broader ecosystem and the other plants that are within it. So yeah, the vineyard itself is not it's a self-pollinating.
Okay. Any other benefits you can think of for the farm with the practices you folks have chosen to use?
I think farming regeneratively helps with the end product quality. So, we were chatting about wine quality and helping to transfer the sense of place or a somewhereness in the wines. And I really believe that farming this way really helps us to do that.
Do you also feel like farming this way, it's like you're doing your bit to address climate change too? Because I'm assuming like without those chemical inputs that some of the other conventional farmers are using around here, probably the carbon footprint of your farm is not as high as some places, presumably.
Yeah, we hope to be doing our part in the ways that we can, the actions that we can take to be mitigating climate change, to have a lighter carbon footprint. We're actually looking to sort of calculate that. That's a future project that we're hoping to work on, is to actually calculate what that is and how we can be reducing it even further, through practices such as waste management. We talked about the livestock waste, but we also have, for example, after harvest, our pumice, so our grape skins that we press for wine. Normally that would be a waste product that we are adding to our compost. So through more practices such as that, if we can find loops where things that would normally be considered waste, we're able to actually create something beneficial out of them, trying to find more streams like that on the farm.
Okay, sounds like you guys got a pretty closed loop system there.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Any benefits that go beyond the farm? So we talked about some like ones that directly impact the farm and some that could impact climate change, but I don't know, maybe some benefits that talk to like community or the human side, or even if you want to loop it back to the taste again. But I'm just curious if there's any benefits to the practices you've chosen to use that go beyond the farm itself.
Yeah, I think the community aspect for us is huge. So it's very exciting to see lots of folks who are becoming more interested in, what they're eating, and as well as what they're drinking and where that's coming from and the ways in which it's made. And so we're really fortunate to have the ability here to connect with consumers directly and talk to them about the practices, why it's important, and hopefully inspire them to reach for products that are made organically. And we're really fortunate to have a very supportive local community that seems to be very engaged in that. So we're able to, through events here, kind of build that sense of community around that, do some education through our team. That's another big avenue for us to be able to kind of spread awareness around, farming and viticulture. I think also we're mindful that we are part of a broader community and neighborhood. We have folks living very close to us, not only our own family, but we have neighbors here nearby. We just opened a trail through the vineyard that connects to the Harvest Moon Trailway. So I think providing a a safe space for people to enjoy nature, as well as connect with the wines and the food that we produce. They're also able to enjoy the beautiful natural outdoors that we have in such abundance here in Nova Scotia.
That's awesome. Yeah, I don't know too many agriculture producers that share their land like that. Like, come here, walk around. I actually was walking on that path earlier. It's really nice.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, it's a peaceful spot for sure.
Totally, yeah. And the sheep are down there too, so it's nice to see the sheep.
Yes, they are there.
Yeah, they're pretty cute. Oh, one actually thing I was wondering, so it sounded like it was a recent thing that certain like restaurants across Canada are starting to carry your wine. Mm-hmm. Do you think that has anything to do with your practices and what you folks are trying to build here?
Yeah.
And the fact that your wine is obviously stellar and tastes really great. So.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, definitely. I think that within the restaurant community, as well as the wine professional community, there is just like the rest of society, a growing kind of awareness of how things are being produced. And we have restaurants approach us because we are farming organically, biodynamically, and they, like us, are finding that their customers are asking and caring about these things. So I definitely think that is helping us to market our wines as well.
So we were talking about reciprocity a little bit earlier. Apparently some of that reciprocity involves learning, I've heard, and it's learning from livestock, so I'm really curious. I think there's a story here you might be able to share.
Yeah, so I'm fortunate to work closely with our flock of sheep that we have here. With that, there's a real seasonal rhythm to my work with them. So, they have seasons, just like the vineyard has seasons, and most of the other things that we do are very seasonally influenced. And with the sheep, they have their lambing season and shearing, and I feel there's a real, they really help to connect me to nature and to those natural rhythms and to the natural world. They also help to definitely bring a bit of that stoicism we were talking about earlier, so that sort of, sense of hope as well. And, we were talking about even in a bad year, it's not always all bad. So within my flock, even when there's flock of sheep, even when there's challenges, there's always some little joys or little triumphs as well. So it's, a reminder to remain optimistic and to remain hopeful and positive, and also to trust in nature a bit too, and in those seasons, and that things won't always be challenging. There will be another day.
Let's get to the bigger picture stuff. This is really my favorite stuff. The main question the series is trying to explore is, or part of the main question the series is trying to explore, is why should consumers care about regenerative agriculture? So I'm asking you as an agriculture producer, why should consumers care about regenerative agriculture?
Well, I think we touched on earlier a bit about we're all facing a global challenge right now with climate change. And I think that agriculture has a very important role to play in that challenge that we're facing. I think that consumers can almost vote with their dollar, so to speak, and so they have a power in it as well. Yeah. And I think it's something that we're all facing. We all need to be aware of and be consuming in ways and producing in ways that are mitigating climate change at first and foremost. So I think that's the number one reason to care. For me, number two would be product quality, I think, as well. So I do find that I myself tend to enjoy products that are made in this way.
The sort of follow up to that is like, why should, and I'm being a bit facetious when I say this too, like, why do consumers need to support agriculture producers that practice regenerative agriculture? Why should they? Why can't producers just go transition on their own? Why do consumers need to support them in this? Well,
one of the first parts of sustainability is financial sustainability, and
it's handy. Yeah?
Producers, it's expensive to sometimes to farm responsibly. And again, consumers can really support the values that they believe in by consuming products that align with those values. And if, as a consumer, you want to make a change and help in this challenge that we have with climate change, that's the best way to do it, is to find products and producers who share your same set of values and support them. We're really fortunate here in Nova Scotia to have a very loyal local support. So our province is incredibly supportive of Nova Scotia wine and of local produce and local agriculture as well. So we're really fortunate to live in a community that just naturally embraces local, and it's so important because we can't really, we can't do what we're doing without that support.
Also related to that one, for a consumer that's listening to this right now and like they're hooked, they're like, okay, I want to go out there and support regenerative agriculture. Do you have any recommendations how they could help out with supporting regenerative agriculture in your community, in your province, across the country, across the world?
Yeah, I think the Regeneration Canada farm map is a great place to start. So it's a wonderful tool to find producers near you that farm regeneratively.
The Regeneration Canada farm map is a great tool for consumers and agriculture producers who are looking to be connected with regenerative agriculture producers living in their area. All you need to do is go to regenerationcanada.org, search for farm map, and then you just kind of choose your own adventure from there. You can search by agriculture practice, certification, products, even agriculture or food services.
Again, here in Nova Scotia, we're super fortunate to have a very robust farmers market culture. So I recommend just going to a farmers market and talking to the producers directly and asking them about how they're farming, and visiting the farm directly when you can. Here at the winery we have tours and tasting experiences, so we're always welcoming folks to come and see firsthand these practices and taste the products. So I think connecting, and we're so lucky to live in an age where we are so connected. We have technology as a tool to do that. So I think you can find a lot of resources online to connect you directly to farms and find producers that again align with your values and support them that way. There's a number of courses and things as well. Here in Nova Scotia we have a local biodynamic farm that does do some workshops, so there are things like that you can find in your area to go to the farm and see firsthand and connect with the farmer and how they're doing things.
So you as a producer, you don't mind if somebody came up to you in a farmer's market and started quizzing you on your practices? That's something you'd welcome?
Yeah, I would. I get excited to chat about what we're doing, and I think especially generally the farmers market here anyway, it's a very kind of social type of environment where folks are usually very happy to share knowledge and experiences and their way of doing things. So I find it's a great way to connect and learn from. I would welcome that, yeah.
Oh, well, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
You hear foodies or people who are just really into the art of producing and preparing food, you hear them talk about the concept of terroir quite often. It's a French term used to describe how the land and environment a product, like a wine, is grown and produced in, impacts an agriculture product's flavor, and gives it other unique characteristics. People who take a lot of pride in their local food culture, they usually talk about terroir. Rachel wasn't kidding either that Nova Scotia has a pretty strong desire and determination to support local food. I actually came across an article from last year, so May of 2023 to be precise. In that article, it said that Nova Scotia has the most farmers markets per capita in Canada.
I asked you why consumers should care about regenerative agriculture, but I'm wondering, why do you care about regenerative agriculture?
For me, in the context of our family farm, hearing the stories of, the generations that came before me, and hearing, them talk about the way that the land is changing, our growing environment is changing. As I look to the future, I realize the importance of, protecting our environment where we are and bettering the soils for future generations. So really for me, it's for the future. So our own family and our community and beyond that. But it's all about the future.
I think the 5th generation of Lightfoots is lucky to have you.
Yeah, hopefully so.
Usually I hit people with like kind of the deeper questions later on, but you mentioned that you really like connecting people with your product. Mm-hmm. What is it? Why is that one of your favorite tasks? What is it that you enjoy about that?
I think, and it's going back to the name of the winery, so Lightfoot and Wolfville. Lightfoot's our family name. Wolfville is the name of the town. So at the very heart of what we do, and even in the name that we chose, it's all about connecting people and place. And I think in wine, one of the things I love the most about wine, and why I've kind of dedicated my life to working in wine so far, that could change, of course, I guess, down the road. But one of the things I love is that wine has this unique ability to kind of tell a story of a time and place and who was there, and the challenges and triumphs of a particular season. And I think it just has this really special, almost like a time capsule, or like a conduit of time and place. And I think for me, what I'm really passionate about is this local area. I think the Annapolis Valley, I'm very fortunate to have grown up here and to live here. It's a very special place, and I love to help kind of connect people to that and what makes it unique and special. And I think wine is an interesting medium to do that through.
I'd like to think that the Stories of Regeneration podcast series is also a conduit to a time and place. But fair enough, it's not quite the palate sensation that Rachel's wines are. Unless Stories of Regeneration eventually becomes a wine, in addition to being a podcast series, a video series, a webinar series, a collection of stories, and that book series I keep mentioning. Thanks for listening to part 5 of Stories of Regeneration. We're going to go from the East Coast in this episode to the West Coast in the next episode, so part 6. And in part 6, we're talking fruit, diversity, resilience with Aaron Goodard of Snowy Mountain Farm of Cawson, BC. Be sure to download and listen. Rural Roots to Climate Solutions is an Alberta-based organization empowering agriculture producers and the communities they live in with climate solutions. Rural Roots runs workshops, farm field days, webinars, and participant-driven projects like the Siksikaitsatipi Agriculture Project and the Regenerative Agriculture Lab. We produce a farmer's blog, and of course, as you know, we do this podcast. For more information about us and all the things we do, go to the website, which is www.rr2cs.ca. The rest of the amazing and talented Rural Roots to Climate Solutions team is Cheyenne Younger, Kristen Mountain, Shelley Seed, Lance Tailfeathers, and Aidan Grind. The podcast is funded by a variety of Alberta-based funders and funders based in other parts of Canada. The Stories of Regeneration project is primarily funded by Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada. The project is led by Regeneration Canada, a fantastic organization that advocates for soil health to mitigate climate change and guarantee a healthy food system. It's an organization that Rural Roots is very proud to partner with. For additional information, videos, blog posts, digital materials about the agriculture producers featured throughout the series, visit regenerationcanada.org. And a big shout out to Antonia, Sarah, Ali, and Paige from Regeneration Canada, and Jean-Marc, Phil, and Obed from the film crew, who worked tirelessly on their Stories of Regeneration project to bring it to life. The interview with Rachel was recorded on the Treaties of Peace and Friendship of 1726 lands. My parts of this episode were recorded on Treaty 7 lands and in the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Happy farming wherever you are in the world. And remember, what's good for the climate is good for the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM at the University of Guelph or via podcast. And thanks to Regeneration Canada and Rural Roots for Climate Solutions for permission to broadcast this episode. Please join us again next time for another episode of Food Farm Talk.